The courtroom smelled of polished wood and tension, the faint trace of old law books lingering in the air. My parents, Laney and Hudson Miller, sat at their table, perfectly composed yet radiating confidence, the way people do when they believe the world is theirs by default. Their eyes locked on me the moment I stepped in, scanning me as though I were some unwelcome interruption in their grand performance. I, Roger Miller, adjusted the jacket over my shoulders, hiding the trembling of my hands. Inside my pocket was a bundle of torn diary pages, Grandpa's final words, ripped by the very people now pointing fingers at me. Their accusations hung heavy in the room: manipulation, deceit, greed. They said I had twisted my grandfather's last days to claim his fortune. And yet here I stood, silent, armed with only the truth. Laney's lips curved into a smirk that didn't reach her eyes. "You'll regret this," she whispered, almost theatrically, leaning toward her lawyer. Hudson, his jaw tight, nodded slightly as if to punctuate her threat. "You're playing a game you can't win." "Roger, the courts won't favor the unwanted child." The judge's gavel tapped lightly against the desk, a reminder that this was not a stage for theatrics. He scanned the room, then paused at me. His eyes narrowed slightly as though he were measuring my very soul. "Excuse me." "Are you?" "Roger Miller." "Your Honor," I said, voice steady, though my heart pounded like a drum. Silence fell like a wave across the courtroom. Every whisper, every rustle of paper, every glance toward my parents seemed to amplify the tension. I placed the torn diary pages on the table in front of me, careful not to let them fall. The pages, yellowed and fragile, carried more weight than any contract, any bank statement, any material proof my parents could muster. They weren't just pages. They were my grandfather's voice, the record of his intentions, the roadmap of his final wishes. Hudson leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "You're holding scraps of paper and calling it truth?" His tone was sharp, but uncertainty flickered behind it. Laney's hands tightened on her folder, knuckles white. They thought this courtroom could be won by bluster, by money, by appearances. They didn't understand that Grandpa had never been about appearances. He had been about justice, fairness, and thoughtfulness, qualities I had inherited, whether they liked it or not. The judge picked up the pages, flipping through carefully, examining the handwriting, the margins, the faint stains of ink that had seeped from one page to another. These are fragments, yet they seem deliberate," he muttered, almost to himself. He looked back at me, a long, piercing gaze that seemed to weigh the entirety of my life in a single glance. My mind wandered briefly to the first day they had left me at my grandparents' home. A small bag, a promise never kept, and the echo of footsteps fading down the long, dusty road. I remembered the warmth of Grandpa David's hands, the gentle voice of Grandma Willow telling me I was never truly alone. Those memories weren't just comfort, they were preparation. Every lesson they had taught me about patience, observation, and strategy brought me here. The murmurs of the gallery grew louder. People leaned forward, sensing the tension, sensing that something monumental was about to unfold. My parents exchanged a glance, the first real doubt crossing their faces. Their confidence, which had seemed unshakable, now trembled like a candle in the wind. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. Every word in the diary was louder than any argument they could conjure. And as the judge's eyes lingered on the pages, I felt it, the subtle shift of power, the slow turn of fate, the first tremor of victory. That had nothing to do with money and everything to do with truth. Then the judge looked up from the diary and, almost imperceptibly, leaned forward. "This changes everything," he said, his voice steady but carrying a weight that seemed to shake the room itself. I took a slow breath, heart hammering, knowing the first move had been made. My parents' eyes widened, fear finally breaking through the carefully maintained masks. And in that moment, I realized that this courtroom, this battle, was not about money. It was about justice, about recognition, about finally proving that the child they abandoned was stronger than they had ever imagined. The gavel hovered above the desk. Silence stretched taut across the room. The next words would decide the first step of this battle, and I was ready. The courtroom seemed to shrink around me as memories flooded. Back, the streets of Santa Fe, the red dirt roads, the adobe houses, the blazing sunlight that had once felt like home. I could almost smell the pine trees around my grandparents' house, hear the gentle rustle of wildflowers in the garden, and feel the weight of my grandfather's hand resting on my shoulder. I had been 1 year old when my parents had left me. A small bag, a vague promise, and a fading figure in the doorway. And that was it. gone. They had abandoned me. But my grandparents had taken me in without hesitation. Judge David Miller and Willow didn't just care for me. They built a life around me. They taught me right from wrong, the power of patience, and how to stand tall even when the world seemed stacked against you. Those early days weren't easy, but they were mine. I grew up in a home where fairness mattered, where a person's word meant more than gold. Grandpa would sit me on his knee and say, "Roger, the most important victories are never the loudest ones. They're the ones nobody notices until it's too late." And Grandma would smile, handing me a cup of warm milk, saying, "You'll see, Roger, life has a way of rewarding those who endure." Now in this courtroom, those lessons were my shield. My parents, who had spent my childhood in wealth, fame, and influence, had tried to erase me from their world. They thought they could bully, intimidate, and manipulate their way through the legal system. But they had underestimated one thing: the quiet strength of a child raised on integrity. The judge held the diary pages in his hands, flipping carefully, examining the words, the subtle annotations Grandpa had left. Every margin, every line, spoke of intent, of purpose, of love for the grandchild they had abandoned. The weight of truth was undeniable. Lainey Miller shifted in her seat, her sharp blue eyes narrowing. "This is just scraps of paper," she said, voice sharp but faltering. "You're making a story out of nothing." Hudson leaned forward, his confident posture beginning to crumble. "You can't expect a court to rule on torn pages." I stayed silent. I let the diary speak for me. Its words carried more weight than any argument they could conjure. Every detail of Grandpa's intentions, the way he had cared for me, the way he had planned his estate, it all pointed to one undeniable truth: I was meant to inherit. The murmurs in the gallery grew louder as the judge studied the pages. I could feel the courtroom tilting, like a ship slowly listing in a storm. My parents had always believed that arrogance and influence could protect them. But here, the law, the truth, and Grandpa's words were far stronger than anything they could buy. Then the judge set the pages down gently and leaned back, fingers steepled. His eyes, sharp and discerning, fixed on my parents. "Mr. and Mrs. Miller, it appears there is more to these claims than mere allegations," he said slowly, his voice echoing in the silent courtroom. "Perhaps some truths have remained hidden, even from you." I caught the flicker of panic in their faces. For the first time, doubt crept into the fortress of their arrogance. They had built their lives on the assumption that I was powerless, an accident they could ignore. But now, everything they had believed about control, wealth, and entitlement was slipping through their fingers. And in that moment, I understood something my grandparents had always taught me. Victory often comes quietly, unseen, and at the perfect moment. I straightened, letting my calm confidence fill the space. This was only the beginning. Grandpa's diary had set the stage, but the real confrontation, the unraveling of lies, the exposure of betrayal, was about to begin. The judge's gaze lingered on the diary longer than I expected, flipping carefully through the pages as though each word weighed a ton. The courtroom had gone silent, the kind of silence that presses against your chest, makes your heart beat audible, and holds every person hostage. My parents shifted nervously, their polished appearances suddenly powerless against the truth lying in fragile, yellowed pages. I remembered the day I had pieced this diary together. Every torn page, every ink smudge, every corner folded or ripped. It had taken weeks to reconstruct. Grandpa had written it with care, each word deliberate, each sentence crafted not just for clarity, but for protection. He had known they would try to erase me, to deny me, and he had left a record impossible to ignore. "Your Honor," I said softly, my voice calm but resonant, "these pages aren't just memories. They're instructions, intentions, and proof of my grandfather's will." He made it clear who was to inherit him and why. Lainey Miller's lips pressed together, a faint tremor betraying her confidence. This is manipulation. You're presenting torn scraps as evidence of intent." Hudson's face darkened. "This is absurd. You can't base a claim on a diary." The judge raised a hand, quieting them. "Mr. and Mrs. Miller, it appears these pages are authentic, and the handwriting is verified. That alone makes them relevant to this case. But there is more," he said, eyes flicking toward me, "than just the words themselves." I leaned forward slightly, heart steady. Grandpa's plan had always been more than just money. It had been about fairness, about testing integrity, about ensuring that the inheritance went to someone who truly understood its value. And now, in this room, his intentions were about to be revealed. I recalled Grandpa's words during our last game of chess, sitting on the veranda as the sun dipped behind the mountains. Roger, life rewards those who see beyond the surface. Those who wait, who watch, who understand, always have the advantage. The judge held the diary, reading aloud a few key lines. It is my wish that Roger Miller, my grandson who has shown wisdom, integrity and care, shall inherit my estate. Let no one be misled by appearances or ambition. The rest is left to the discretion of the court and the laws of our land. A gasp echoed through the courtroom. Laney's face went pale. Hudson's jaw tightened so visibly it looked as though it might break. They had always assumed the inheritance was theirs by right, by blood, by proximity, by greed. They had never counted on integrity being written into the will itself. I remained calm, letting the diary speak for me. Every word Grandpa had written was a shield, a weapon, and a revelation. The murmurs in the gallery grew louder as the courtroom absorbed the weight of his intentions. Friends, strangers, even the clerks all realized this was more than a legal proceeding. This was a reckoning. Laney's voice cracked. We never knew. That's impossible. Hudson leaned closer, whispering, This changes everything. The judge's eyes narrowed, scanning both of them carefully. It appears some intentions were ignored, some truths dismissed. The law must now consider the full context of these writings. And then, just as tension reached its peak, the judge paused, flipping to the last page. His expression shifted, something unreadable flickering across his face. He looked directly at me. Mr. Miller, there is something here that goes beyond the ordinary. This final page contains instructions not just for inheritance, but for a legacy, a plan left by your grandfather that affects more than finances. It appears to involve actions that must be followed carefully. My parents' eyes widened in disbelief, fear mingling with anger. They leaned forward, trying to read over the judge's shoulder, desperate to see what had been hidden from them. I felt a thrill, the quiet satisfaction of someone who had waited, watched, and understood the game Grandpa had set into motion. This wasn't over. It was only the beginning. The judge's eyes flicked back to me, sharp and calculating, and the room seemed to shrink around the weight of what he was about to say. Every person in that courtroom leaned in, senses straining, waiting for the revelation that could shatter the lives of my parents. Mr. Miller, the judge began slowly, his voice echoing with authority. It appears your grandfather's instructions were not merely about who receives his estate. There is a sequence, a series of tasks set forth to ensure the inheritance is awarded to the person most deserving. And it seems you, Roger, have been prepared to follow them. My parents froze. Laney's hand trembled on the table, and Hudson's knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge. For the first time, their confidence, their sense of entitlement faltered. They had assumed the inheritance was theirs by default. They hadn't counted on Grandpa's intelligence, his foresight, or the careful way he had designed his legacy to favor someone with integrity. The judge lifted the final page of the diary. These instructions are clear, he continued, voice low, almost reverent. They involve not only the proper execution of his will, but also uncovering truths that have been hidden from this court. The first task, Mr. Miller, will be revealed today. I felt my heart pound, though I kept my face calm. This was the moment Grandpa had built toward. Years of preparation, lessons learned from his wisdom. Every piece of guidance he had left me, it all converged here. My parents had no idea what was coming. They had underestimated the quiet child they had abandoned, the boy who had grown into a man with patience, strategy, and resolve. The courtroom held its breath as the judge unfolded a sealed envelope, placing it carefully before me. Inside this envelope, he said, is the first of your grandfather's directives. You may proceed when ready. But be aware, the outcome of these actions will determine the remainder of the proceedings. I reached forward slowly, my fingers brushing the paper. It felt heavier than anything in my life, though it was merely a piece of parchment. The weight wasn't physical. It was the gravity of responsibility, the consequence of truth, the power of legacy. Laney's eyes widened. What is that? You can't just... Hudson's voice cut in, trembling. That's not fair. We've raised you. We should... I ignored them, tearing open the envelope. Inside was a single crisp page, Grandpa's handwriting meticulous and deliberate. It wasn't just instructions, it was a puzzle, a challenge designed to test integrity, intelligence, and foresight, a final chess move set decades in advance. The judge leaned forward, his gaze intense. Mr. Miller, the first step requires not only execution, but also discretion. This will reveal who is truly deserving of the inheritance. It must be followed exactly as written. I read the page aloud to myself, hearing the words in the courtroom, feeling their weight. It was a journey, a test, and a revelation all at once. It demanded patience, strategy, and a calm mind, qualities my parents had never possessed. Their faces fell. Laney's lips parted in shock. Hudson's jaw slackened. They were realizing finally that this wasn't about fighting me in court. This was about failing to understand the man Grandpa had prepared to inherit everything. They had spent decades assuming entitlement was enough. They had been wrong. I looked up at the judge. "I understand, Your Honor," I said quietly, determination ringing through my voice. "I will follow my grandfather's instructions." A murmur rippled through the gallery. The judge nodded slowly, as if acknowledging both the weight of responsibility and the precision required to carry it out. The moment hung, suspended in the tense air, every heartbeat echoing like a drum. I unfolded the page carefully, my eyes scanning every line. Grandpa's handwriting was precise, deliberate, almost hypnotic in its clarity. It wasn't just words, it was a challenge. A riddle wrapped in strategy. A test designed to separate the deserving from the unworthy. The instructions were simple to read, but impossible to execute without thought. I needed to retrieve a specific ledger from the family company archives. A ledger hidden for decades, containing the records of Grandpa's private decisions, the ones my parents had tried to erase or manipulate. Every step demanded discretion, observation, and patience. If I failed, the inheritance could be called into question. My parents leaned forward, craning their necks to see the paper. Their faces were masks of disbelief, anger, and fear. For the first time, they realized that this wasn't about wealth. This wasn't about courtroom theatrics, and it certainly wasn't about who had the most influence. This was about capability, character, and preparation. The very qualities Grandpa had nurtured in me. Laney whispered under her breath, This is ridiculous. He can't do it." Hudson scoffed, but even he hesitated, uncertainty creeping into his voice. "How could he possibly—" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The diary, the instructions, the lessons my grandparents had taught me, they were all enough. I had grown up under their guidance, learning patience, strategy, and foresight, while my parents had been blind to consequence, blind to principle. Later that day, I drove to the archives. The office building was familiar, a place where I had spent years as a prosecutor but never imagined would become a chessboard for my grandfather's final game. I walked through the halls quietly, careful not to alert anyone, careful to move with purpose. Every step echoed in my mind like Grandpa's voice. Observe first, act second, win quietly. I found the ledger exactly where Grandpa's notes had indicated. Dust covered its edges, as if it had been waiting decades for someone worthy to discover it. I opened it carefully, revealing entries that validated every word in the diary, every claim I had about the inheritance, numbers, dates, and notes intertwined to form a map of truth, a map my parents had ignored for greed and arrogance. Back in the courtroom, I presented the ledger to the judge. Every eye in the room widened as the contents were revealed. This wasn't just proof. It was irrefutable evidence of integrity, intention, and rightful inheritance. My parents' expressions crumbled. Laney's face drained of color. Hudson's fists clenched so tightly I thought his knuckles might crack. They had spent decades assuming entitlement, assuming the court would side with them automatically. But Grandpa had designed this to test character, and I had passed. The judge leaned forward, flipping through the ledger carefully. "It seems the first stage of Mr. Miller's instructions has been completed successfully," he said, voice low but firm. "However—" I froze for a heartbeat. The word hung in the air, heavy and foreboding. "The second stage, the one that determines the final outcome, has yet to be executed," the judge continued, eyes locking on my parents. "And it requires judgment, wisdom, and discretion beyond what most can offer." Their faces fell completely. For the first time, the illusion of control they had wielded for decades shattered. They were powerless now, watching as the game they thought they controlled moved entirely beyond their reach. I exhaled slowly, letting the calm of preparation settle over me. Grandpa's plan was unfolding perfectly. Every step, every test, every revelation was bringing me closer to what he had intended: justice. integrity and the fulfillment of his legacy. The courtroom buzzed with tension. Spectators whispered, sensing that something monumental was happening. My parents shifted uncomfortably, desperate to find a foothold, a loophole, anything to regain power. But the path was set. The next task would decide everything. The courtroom was a cage of tension, every eye trained on the unfolding drama, every whisper like a tremor waiting to erupt into a storm. The judge leaned forward, fingers steepled, his gaze piercing through the facade my parents had tried so hard to maintain. The second stage, he began, requires more than documentation. It requires judgment, patience, and understanding of the legacy entrusted to Mr. Miller. The next actions will determine the final allocation of inheritance and reveal the true intentions behind these decades-long manipulations. I felt a surge of resolve. Grandpa's plan had been deliberate, meticulous, and far beyond anything my parents could have imagined. This was the culmination of years of lessons, of silent preparation, of living with integrity while they chased appearances. Every move, every decision had led to this moment. The instructions were clear. I needed to confront my parents, not with anger or theatrics, but with the undeniable evidence of their past deceit and the meticulous care Grandpa had taken to prepare me. This stage wasn't just about law. It was about strategy, observation, and revealing character. I stood, slowly walking toward them, letting the weight of my presence settle over the room. Laney's eyes widened, Hudson's jaw tightened. They had assumed I would crumble under the weight of accusation, that fear or intimidation would sway me. But I was calm, collected, the embodiment of every lesson Grandpa had ever taught me. The judge handed me a folder sealed with a wax emblem, Grandpa's personal seal. Inside this folder, the judge explained, are further directives. You may proceed. I opened it carefully. The pages inside revealed more than financial instructions. They revealed context, history, and the moral compass Grandpa had entrusted to me. It outlined moments from my parents' lives they had tried to hide, instances where greed and ambition overshadowed family, where choices were made that left me abandoned. Laney's hand flew to her mouth. How did he know? She whispered, voice trembling. Hudson's eyes darted nervously. This is impossible. I didn't flinch. I let the pages speak. I summarized key points to the judge, laying out the evidence with precision and calm. Each fact, each memory, each line of proof tore away at the illusion my parents had maintained for decades. The courtroom sat in stunned silence. Friends, family, strangers, all were captivated by the unfolding story of betrayal, wisdom, and rightful justice. The judge's expression was unreadable as he flipped through the folder. Then he looked at me directly. Mr. Miller, it is clear you have fulfilled the second stage of your grandfather's plan with integrity and discernment. But the final stage, he paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. The final stage will reveal not only the ultimate allocation of inheritance, but also the moral resolution he intended. I felt a thrill of anticipation. Grandpa had designed this plan like a chess game. Every step had been a test, every decision deliberate. I had passed the first stage with strategy, the second with discernment. The final stage would be the ultimate reveal, one that would leave no doubt, one that would expose the truth of character beyond wealth or influence. My parents' faces were etched with desperation now. They leaned forward, whispering to each other, but it was useless. Every step of Grandpa's plan had been designed to bypass their arrogance and entitlement. They had assumed they could intimidate, charm, or manipulate. They were wrong. I glanced at the diary one last time, feeling the quiet presence of my grandfather's guidance. His wisdom, his patience, his foresight, all had brought me here. I was ready. The judge stood, signaling the gravity of the next moment. The final stage would be revealed in court, in front of everyone, and it would decide everything. I straightened my shoulders, feeling the weight of legacy, justice, and truth settle over me. Every spectator leaned forward, sensing the culmination of decades-long deceit, patience, and strategy. My parents' confident facades had cracked. Their fear was palpable. This was not just a legal battle. It was the unveiling of a lifetime of integrity versus entitlement. And then the judge spoke, his voice low, commanding, and final. The final stage, Mr. Miller, will determine not only the inheritance but the acknowledgement of your grandfather's intentions. The moment you step forward to fulfill it, all secrets will be revealed. Are you prepared? I took a deep breath, letting the calm of preparation, the lessons of my grandparents, and the quiet strength of my own conviction guide me. The courtroom was charged, with a tension so thick it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. Every eye was on me. Roger Miller, the grandson they had abandoned, the child they had thought powerless, the man who had grown under the guidance of the wisest people I had ever known. Grandpa's diary, the ledger, and the secret instructions had brought us to this precipice. The final stage, and the moment where truth, justice, and legacy collided, had arrived. The judge's gaze swept the room slowly, weighing the gravity of the moment. "Mr. Miller," he said, voice low but resonant, "you now stand on the threshold of the final stage of your grandfather's plan. The actions you take in the next moments will reveal not only the rightful allocation of his estate, but the very measure of character that he intended to be judged." My parents, Laney and Hudson, sat at their table, faces pale, hands trembling. They leaned forward, whispering urgently to each other, panic creeping into their previously confident postures. Every ounce of arrogance they had carried into this courtroom had been stripped away, replaced by the stark reality that the inheritance they believed was theirs by entitlement was now a game they could not control. I stepped forward, holding the final folder Grandpa had left me. The envelope was sealed with his emblem, a symbol of authority, legacy, and meticulous planning. I could almost feel his presence beside me, whispering through the generations, guiding me as he had always done. Every lesson, every hour of preparation, every ounce of patience had led to this moment. I opened the folder carefully, revealing a series of directives and letters addressed to me, each containing intricate instructions, moral guidance, and challenges designed to test the depth of my integrity. They detailed not only the allocation of wealth, but also the restoration of justice, the acknowledgement of truth, and the exposure of long-buried deceit. It was more than inheritance. It was a revelation, a reckoning, a masterstroke of foresight from the man who had seen further than anyone else in our family. The first directive instructed me to address my parents directly, not with anger or accusation, but with undeniable proof of their actions, their omissions, and the consequences of the choices they had made decades earlier. I felt the weight of that responsibility settle on my shoulders, but it did not crush me. I had been prepared for this. Every challenge Grandpa had laid out, every moral lesson, every strategic insight had led me here. I began to speak, my voice calm, deliberate, and unwavering. "Mom, Dad, or should I say Laney and Hudson, this is not about wealth, not about titles, not about appearances. This is about truth. Grandpa's diary, the ledger, and these final instructions make it clear who he trusted, who he intended to inherit, and who truly understands the weight of responsibility that comes with his legacy." Laney's lips parted, her eyes wide. "Roger, Quiet," I said softly but firmly. The courtroom fell silent instantly, the murmurs of spectators replaced by a collective tension. "I will show you exactly what Grandpa intended." I presented the ledger first, the painstakingly preserved document that detailed Grandpa's private decisions, his financial planning, and the rationale for why I was chosen as the rightful heir. Every entry, every annotation, every line confirmed what the diary had said. I was the one he trusted, the one he believed had the integrity, patience, and judgment to uphold his legacy. The judge leaned forward, reading along carefully, his expression solemn but approving. "It is undeniable," he said, his voice echoing through the courtroom, "that the directives, ledger entries, and diary are coherent, authentic, and clearly reflective of the test and intentions your grandfather set forth." Hudson's hands clenched on the edge of the table, and Laney's face was pale as a sheet. For the first time, the illusion of control they had clung to for decades shattered completely. They had assumed arrogance, entitlement, and influence could secure their inheritance. They were wrong. Then I moved to the second directive, which required me to demonstrate not just comprehension of Grandpa's plan, but the courage and foresight to execute it properly. It involved notifying key stakeholders in the family business, ensuring that each of Grandpa's intentions was protected from manipulation, and revealing evidence that my parents had tried to destroy. This step was critical. It was the one that would prove not only my right to the inheritance, but also my moral and strategic capabilities. I stood calm and deliberate, walking toward the front of the courtroom as the judge instructed. I spoke clearly, addressing the gallery, the attorneys, and my parents simultaneously. "I have completed the first steps of Grandpa's plan. I have recovered the ledger, verified every entry, and ensured the diary's instructions are intact. The second step involves exposing the truth that has been hidden for decades. I revealed documents and testimonies that showed, beyond any doubt, the patterns of neglect, the choices made out of greed, and the ways my parents had sought to manipulate both Grandpa and me. Every witness nodded. Every clerk and gallery member leaned forward, stunned by the clarity and weight of evidence. Laney's voice trembled. This is impossible. You can't. Hudson's face contorted with frustration and disbelief. We gave you everything. How could you? But I didn't respond. Grandpa had always said, victory comes quietly, unseen, and at the perfect moment. I let the evidence speak for itself. Every word, every document, every letter confirmed the narrative of truth, responsibility, and rightful inheritance. The judge turned to me, his eyes sharp. Mr. Miller, the final directive remains. Execute it properly, and the estate, the legacy, and justice itself will be aligned with your grandfather's wishes. I took a deep breath and opened the last envelope, a set of instructions so precise, so deliberate, that even the smallest deviation would invalidate the process. Grandpa's final words were a mix of advice, strategy, and moral guidance. They were designed not only to reveal the true heir, but also to expose the character of those who had sought to claim what was never theirs. The final task required a confrontation, not one of anger or hostility, but of revelation. I read aloud each line, presenting the evidence calmly, methodically, and with the weight of decades of preparation. Every secret my parents had buried, every act of neglect, every choice made out of greed was now in the open. The courtroom gasped. Spectators whispered in disbelief. Lawyers shifted uncomfortably. My parents could only stare, powerless, as the truth unfolded. Laney fell back in her seat, tears streaming down her face. We didn't know it would come to this. Hudson's hands trembled. We never imagined, but it was too late. The game was over. Grandpa's plan had been executed perfectly. Every step, every lesson, every piece of evidence had converged to ensure justice, integrity, and the rightful inheritance. The judge, his expression solemn, looked at my parents one last time. It is clear that the rightful heir, as intended by Judge David Miller, is Roger Miller. The estate, the legacy, and the responsibility now belong to him. The court acknowledges the completion of the final stage of the instructions and the full execution of the grandfather's plan. A wave of relief, triumph, and quiet satisfaction washed over me. I had done what Grandpa had intended. I had proven that integrity, patience, and understanding far outweighed arrogance, entitlement, and greed. My parents sat in stunned silence. Their power, influence, and confidence had crumbled completely. They had been defeated, not through confrontation, but through the meticulous, deliberate, and moral execution of Grandpa's plan. I stood tall, feeling the weight of the moment, the presence of my grandparents, and the realization that the child they had abandoned had grown into the man they could never break. I had followed Grandpa's instructions to the letter, executed his vision, and ensured that his legacy would be honored exactly as he intended. The courtroom erupted in whispers, admiration, and disbelief. People stood, clapped, and nodded. Justice had been served. Integrity had prevailed. And my parents finally understood that legacy is not inherited through greed or force, but earned through character, patience, and wisdom. As I gathered the documents and looked around the room, I felt a sense of closure, fulfillment, and pride unlike anything I had ever experienced. Grandpa's plan had succeeded beyond measure, and I, Roger Miller, had become the man he knew I could be. Not just an heir, but a guardian of truth, justice, and the legacy of a lifetime. The final gavel struck, echoing like a drumbeat of victory. The inheritance, the legacy, and the acknowledgement of decades-long intentions were now mine. And my parents had no choice but to accept the truth. For the first time in my life, I felt complete, vindicated, and ready to step into a future built not on entitlement or privilege, but on the principles that Grandpa had instilled in me: patience, integrity, and unwavering wisdom. The court cleared, but the story of that day, the revelation, the triumph, and the complete reversal of expectations would be remembered forever. Grandpa had orchestrated it perfectly, and I had executed it flawlessly. The legacy was mine. The truth had prevailed. The final move had been made, and no one would ever forget it.